Segregation in our public schools remains one of American society's biggest problems. Why are major corporations leading the legal fights to challenge these entrenched inequalities? On this episode of Unscripted, we're talking to Robert Garda, professor at the Loyola University New Orleans College of Law. Garda is the author of the 2011 paper published by the Florida Law Review, The White Interest in School Integration. Garda spoke to a group of students at Clarke Central High School in Athens, and later we talked in the library of the school. 58 years after Brown versus Board of Education, how extreme is racial segregation in schools today?
It's incredible, really, especially when you consider it in light of the fact that our country has become so much more diverse since Brown and since the 1960s, sort of post-Brown, that we still have maintained the same level of segregation in our schools as we had at that time. So of course, if you think that the country and our schools are becoming more diverse as a whole, and when you look at the statistics, we've gone from 22% minorities in 1972 to 44% minorities in 2007, yet we've maintained the same level of segregation in our schools. That's remarkable, and some people would call that resegregation.
So is it possible to unpack that a little bit without casting aspersions? I mean, why do parents do that? Is that who is to blame, if that's the right word?
Yes, it is. I mean, the entire reason we have school segregation is because we have residential segregation. So until recently, of course, you were only placed in your neighborhood school. And so if your neighborhood is segregated, your school is necessarily segregated. Now, there are different types of plans that have cropped up. For example, I'm from New Orleans. You can go to any school in New Orleans that you want to. It's a free choice. So residential segregation does not lead to school segregation there. But in a vast majority of the school districts in the country, you go to your neighborhood school, and that is what really leads to school segregation, is neighborhood segregation. And so you'll have, the wealthy neighborhood where maybe race doesn't matter, but it's the wealthy neighborhood, and I want to move to the wealthy neighborhood to have the nice house and maybe have the nice school. And I might not care about race whatsoever. I just kind of want to live in the big house with the nice school. That's going to lead to racial segregation because we still have this correlation between race and socioeconomic status. Now, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's still a very strong correlation. And so as long as race and socioeconomic status have a correlation, I think we're going to continue to see this residential and therefore school segregation.
So does that mean that white students are some of the most racially segregated kids in America?
Yes, white students are the most racially segregated kids in the United States. And there's a lot of ways to measure segregation, sort of exposure rates, or what percentage of them go to school with minorities. And it doesn't matter which way you measure it, we still turn out to be the most isolated race in the country in our schools.
Part of what interested me in this topic when I first read about it was it's a discussion that every parent has. Where is my child going to go to school?
Yes.
So you see that as the beginning of this, and it's been going on since segregation was officially ended by the Supreme Court,
right,
and yet it's brought us into today as well, all stemming from this conversation.
Right.
Is that something that happened to you personally?
Oh yes, that's how this came up entirely. I mean, I've written this big law review article, but it did not start as something that I sat in my office thinking, oh, this will be neat to write about. This happened in my family. So it was 3 years ago. My daughter was in 8th grade at a private white girls' school, and we had to make a decision. Is she going to stay there? Is she going to start 9th grade at the big public high school, maybe go to another private school? And so these discussions came up in my family about where she should go. My wife thought, why would we leave the school? She's comfortable there. It's got incredibly high academics. There's nothing wrong with where she is. Why rock the boat? And I was very adamant about, no, we should send her to the public school, which is this wonderfully diverse school. Maybe a marginal decrease in academics, maybe. And I was trying to articulate to her why I thought it was important to go to a diverse school, and I couldn't do it. I just said, oh, well, I went to a really diverse school, and I thought it was a great thing. And she's saying, well, wait, I can come up with these 5 concrete reasons why she should stay at her school. And I was saying, oh, but I know diversity is important. So I thought, I can't come up with any concrete reasons. I'm going to go research this and figure it out. And I was able to come up with the concrete reasons. So that's how it came up in our family. And as I was writing this article, that was what was in the forefront of my mind. And even at the end of the article, I kind of put this sentence in of, I hope I've convinced white parents to send their kids to integrated schools. Now I just need to convince my wife. Now that's taken out in the final version, but I wrote it with the perspective of, I'm going to hand this to my wife to proofread, and hopefully that will change her decision, which it did. White parents often have many more choices about where they're going to live and therefore where they're going to send their kids to school. And so when you're deciding where I'm going to live or where I want to send my kids to school, we have always considered race. And we've usually considered race as a negative thing. Oh, I need to avoid that school because there's too many of a certain minority group. And I firmly believe we need to be looking at it as a positive thing for our kids. So consider race, yes, but consider it as a plus, not a minus.
Right. Diversity seems to have gotten a bad rap over time.
Oh, yes.
It's because, or is it because we think it's benefiting someone else?
I think so. Oh, I mean, when you think of affirmative action or desegregating the schools, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh, it's done to help the minorities. And certainly that's why Brown was done. Mm-hmm. But what's fallen by the wayside is, so when we think of affirmative action, when we think of desegregation, the first thing that pops into our mind is it going to help the minorities? What's the effect on the minorities? And the only way we think about it in terms of the white interest is it going to hurt my kids? Mm-hmm. Should I oppose busing? How long are they going to sit on the bus? Those types of things. What the Supreme Court research and the social science research and all these things I've looked at really show, though, is that whites gain an awful lot from affirmative action plans and from desegregation efforts or voluntary integration plans. And if we really want to permanently integrate our schools, we need to show that whites benefit from it. And so that's been missing in a lot of the literature from my perspective. And that's what we need to start thinking about is the benefits that whites get out of these diverse educational environments, instead of just thinking about the minority side. No, don't get me wrong. That side really is probably the more important side. And I believe in integrated schools because I think it helps everybody, minorities and whites, poor, rich. But if we're going to create enduring integrated schools and really care about it, whites need to buy in.
That's the whole thing, right? That equality raises everyone's performance. It's not a zero-sum situation.
It is not a zero-sum situation. That's what's really amazing about the educational research is when you put smart kids and not so smart kids in the same classroom, not everyone comes to the middle. Instead, what happens is everyone raises to the top is what's shown. So maybe that's a little bit counterintuitive, but the educational research is very consistent with a rising tide lifts all boats.
Is that why we have such a difficult time grasping that?
Probably, and I think there's certainly some race aversion going on. Mm-hmm. There's certainly a concern that, I wouldn't send my kid there because they have different races and that might make me uncomfortable. I don't want to send my child there because I worry that the academics aren't as strong, because I know I'm sending my kid to, say, like the private white school that I was sending my daughter to. This was full of very wealthy, smart girls. And there's a concern that maybe if I go to the public school where not everyone is as brilliant as they were at my old school, the standard of teaching will go down, or the quality of education my daughter will go down. It's simply not the case. Like I say, rising tide lifts all boats. Really, she's learning as much academically at the new school as she did at the old school. And of course, she's learning a lot more socially at the new school than she did at the last school.
Do you find that the argument begins to lose a little steam whenever we supply enough facts to make it so? Or does it need to be equally or at least partially a little bit abstract to make sense to us? For example, is it important to push the idea that children need to be a part of the community in which they live?
Oh, it's absolutely important to push that, but that's not what convinces parents to change schools. So I can make very persuasive arguments that integration is good for democracy. I can make really persuasive arguments that integration might be your civic duty, that integration helps minorities. But that's not what persuades parents to change their kids' schools. What persuades a parent to change their kid's school is it going to help my kid? We're going to put our kids' interests above these sort of esoteric civic duties or democratic principles any day of the week. I'm not going to change my kid's school because I think it's my civic duty. if I think it hurts my kid.
Right.
You can show everyone the Supreme Court statements that it'll help your kids. What I really want to know is it make my kid more employable? Is it going to open opportunities that they otherwise would not have? And that's why the business evidence, to me, of all the evidence I have, is the most persuasive. Because the businesses are screaming out loud, we want kids with cross-cultural competence. Please get cross-cultural competence. It's important in the business world for a myriad of reasons. And I think that's the most persuasive evidence to a parent.
It's a little counterintuitive to think that the business community gets out front of an issue like this.
I know.
And then it isn't. In very broad terms, they played a similar role during the civil rights movement itself.
No, that's exactly right. And it's interesting that the business movement, so there was a voluntary integration plan in Louisville, and it was hatched by the businesses, not by civil rights activists or parents. It was hatched by the businesses realizing, wait, we're going to have a better workforce. We're going to have a more educated workforce if we reintegrate our schools. Now in Louisville, they had desegregated their schools under a desegregation order pursuant to Brown. They had been found to be in unitary status, so the court was no longer intentionally integrating the schools, but it was so popular, especially among the businesses, that the businesses wanted to keep it going, so they created a voluntary integration program. That ended up getting struck down by the Supreme Court, but they're so wed to it and so dedicated to it that they are continuing to try it in a constitutional way now. And it's hard. It is hard to find a way around that parents-involved decision to make a voluntary integration plan that's constitutional, but they're figuring a way out.
Wow. Wow, it gets really complex, and yet Americans, we believe in this free market system we live in. We believe big business to a large extent.
We do.
Well, you think they'll be able to lead us in this direction?
I know. Well, one thing that makes people cynical, though, when they see big business in support of affirmative action and in support of integration is because we've become so accustomed to sort of affirmative action in the workplace that we think, oh, GM and DuPont and IBM are supporting affirmative action at Michigan Law School and Michigan undergraduate because they want a large pool of diverse candidates to choose from to sort of fulfill their affirmative action requirements.
Right.
But when you read their briefs to the Supreme Court, very little of it is about we need a bigger applicant pool of minority candidates. It's almost all about we need a bigger applicant pool of people that are used to dealing with minorities. And so it is not this sort of, like I said, the cynical view of why the businesses wrote the brief was to increase the applicant pool of minorities. That is not how those briefs read at all. Their arguments are not about more minorities. Their arguments about get us more people that have cross-cultural competence. You know, I was most surprised by the business aspect of it.
Really?
I knew that, of course, being very familiar with all the jurisprudence from the Supreme Court, I knew what was there. I knew I was going to find my support there. I sort of knew the social science research. I knew I was going to find that. What really shocked me was diving into the briefs that big business submitted to the Supreme Court. I went into it thinking, of course, they support this just because they want a big applicant pool of minorities. But wow, I read all their briefs, and it just alarmed me how sort of on board they were with all the social science research saying we need cross-cultural competence, and they really laid out the very precise reasons why it mattered to them. They weren't just arguing this big theoretical idea.
Wow.
They were saying we need it for the following 3 reasons, and they were very concrete about it.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, really, that the business community in this aspect or community, you know, the larger idea, gets a little touchy-feely about this subject.
I know. Well, to me, it really is their bottom line,
right?
And they're arguing from the bottom line. They're saying it helps our business if we have people that are cross-culturally competent. We are going to be selling to an increasingly diverse United States. We need people that are going to get that market. We are going to have an increasingly diverse workforce. We need people that are comfortable in that workforce. We're going to have increasingly diverse business partners. We need people that are going to be comfortable dealing with them as well. So they really always bring it back to their bottom line. The language they're using is not, this will make us feel better. The language they're using is, this matters for our profits.
Right, and that was one of the things I was going to ask you about, how much this has to do with changing demographics in the country. With new majority-minority states like California and Texas, and there are a couple of more now, right?
I think that's what's driving it for business. I think that the 2 factors that are driving it is, of course, the increasing diversity we're getting in the United States. You're absolutely right. We're seeing those switches in Texas and California, and the globalization. So either one of those independently, I think, would have been enough for business to recognize we need people that are comfortable dealing across culture and race, but combined, it's just brought it to the forefront for business that they absolutely need those types of employees. So, you know, they recognize very well that by 2054, the majority of the there's going to be no majority of the market.
Right.
It's going to be
That's the whole point, right?
That's the whole point.
Right. And well, it has many other implications for our country politically and economically and otherwise.
Oh yes.
And so maybe this is one of the leading indicators that is going to help us understand that change going on.
I agree. Oh, I absolutely agree. I was asked a really interesting question by someone else saying, oh, well, are you telling me that China is worse at business than the United States because they're a monoculture? Well, if that's true, then how come China is killing us in the market? And I said, well, China's killing us in the market for a lot of reasons, but if you made everything else equal, price point, all the protectionist clauses, if China and the United States were equal in all other regards, except for our sort of diversity value, I think America would come out on top. I think it really helps that we have this diverse country to deal with what is in the end an incredibly diverse global marketplace. China does not. And so I do think it gives us a competitive advantage. Does it mean that we're better than China right now? No, because there's a million other factors that go into determining how many widgets you sell.
Right. But it comes down to us believing in this thing that we already are.
Yes, that's what's great about it. Right. So, and I like how you put that, believing in this thing we already are. So here we have to compete in a global marketplace. One of the things that matters is cross-cultural competence. We've got everything we need built into the United States. It makes us unique among all other countries that we have this wonderful diversity. We need to maximize on that. We've got, unlike every other country, we have the ability to develop our cross-cultural competence like no one else can. And if we can maximize on that, it's going to help us in the globalized economy. Cross-cultural competence is this shorthand for a much larger idea.
Right.
And it's easier to say it, but what cross-cultural competence really means to me and to American businesses, comfort dealing with people that are different than you racially and ethnically. So it's a comfort level, it's an adaptability, and an openness to dealing with folks that don't necessarily look, think, or act like you. So when you say cross-cultural competence, it's a shorthand for those ideas.
So that means we've got to separate ourselves from some of these things like fear and distrust of others.
I know. We need to embrace it instead of fear it.
Right.
It's so hard to do, though.
What is that? How does that happen?
Oh, please tell me. Please tell me. Well, what's interesting is this idea of integration and cross-cultural competence, it snowballs on itself. And so at the height of integration, so Brown versus Board of Education was, of course, passed. In the South, you get 10 years of massive resistance where no one listened. And then you sort of get the height of integration between 64 and 75. That's when our schools were sort of the most integrated. And what's been shown in studies from that period is kids that graduated that time during its most integrated setting were much more likely to graduate, go to a more integrated college, live in a more integrated neighborhood, work in a more integrated work setting, send their kids to a more integrated school. And what that shows is it snowballs. Once I get a comfort level, it's going to last me the rest of my life. And I'm going to probably seek that sort of integration level out for my kids as well. Of course, the converse is true as well.
Right.
If I'm in an isolated setting, that's where I'm going to be comfortable in. Now, what's disturbing is we didn't quite get enough momentum to push us to the everyone seeking integration because of Supreme Court decisions and a lot of other things.
Right.
Integration went by the wayside. We started resegregating. And now people have got back to this sort of discomfort level with the other races instead of vice versa. So if we could just push the needle a little bit, like I say, it snowballs. The kids here at Clarke Central, I think they're going to grow up and work in really integrated settings and be very comfortable. And I think that they're going to seek out similar high schools for their kids.
That's hopeful.
That's hopeful, right?
Yeah, no, it is in a good way, and I believe you. I was noticing when you were talking to them that they seem to understand what you were saying.
I know,
Do you
to
think?
the point where it put them to sleep, because like, oh, I've been there, done that. What are you talking? I don't need to know this. I can see the benefit to me. It was interesting. Of course, race is a very difficult thing to talk about on any level,
Right.
and at the high school, any level. And so the more interesting questions I got was, once it all shut down, and students came to talk to me individually afterwards.
Right.
Those were good, nice, hard-hitting questions that I could understand why they did not ask in front of the group. It is tough to ask some race-based type questions in front of the group. But I agree. I was preaching to the choir. They knew everything I was going to say before I said it.
What were some of those things? I mean, if you can paraphrase, did they have pointed questions about that pertain to their own situation?
Yes.
Oh, they did.
So their pointed questions were, well, if a kid's acting terrible in class, how is that helping me? And it's not helping you, okay? It's not helping you.
That's a great question.
It is a great question. And they said, here's what's helping you, though, is this was a white student asking me this question, and I could tell by the question the race of the kid acting poorly in class. And I said, well, here's what is helping you, though, is that you're at a school with an awful lot of kids that look different than you. If you were at a school of just where 5 kids look different than you, and there was 5 black kids, and 3 of them were the ones that were messing with your classroom experience, you would probably create a stereotype in your mind that racial minority is trouble in the class. You're at a school, though, where you have a ton of different racial minorities. You've seen some of them make trouble in your class. You've seen some of them be in the AP classes. You've seen some that are just like you. You've seen the gamut.
Right.
And so the benefit you're getting is you're never getting a benefit from a kid causing problem in the class. You're getting a benefit from not stereotyping that conduct to all the kids of his race.
Right.
And he said, you're right. So,
Yeah, it's not impossible, but it's harder for him to generalize.
yes. Oh, yeah, not impossible. It's just harder, right?
Yeah.
Because he's seen the gamut. He's
Right.
realized there's no such thing as all black people are this way. He's realized, wait, within the black community, there's a million different perspectives and viewpoints and conduct.
Which is a giant step.
Which is a giant step, right. And he walked away saying, I get it. I think he was expecting me to defend that you got to put up with the bad kid in your class, which no, that's always bad.
Yeah, well, that is probably what a lot of people tend to believe is that, well, this is asking something else of me. I've got to do something
Right.
in this scenario. And I think the implicit case you're making is something good is happening to you in this situation, whatever you do. If you do nothing, just do what you normally do.
Right. No, that's exactly. Do what you're going to do. Now, I think if everyone in his class is acting up, no matter what the race, that's a big problem. And
Sure.
you don't want to go to a school where everyone in the classroom is acting up. But
Right.
it is fine to go to a school where a couple of kids are acting up. And I asked him, like, well, tell me, are white kids acting up too? He said, yes. I'm saying, well, see, that you can't generalize among any of the races about who's going to act up.
Right.
And it's great that you're seeing at this school that every different race has got every different kind of person within it.
Is it going to continue to play itself out in the courtrooms this way? Is it an unsettled question, really? Or?
It's an unsettled question. So the parents involved in Community Schools case, which was decided in 2007 by the Supreme Court, struck down the voluntary affirmative action plans in Seattle and in Jefferson or Louisville. But it was a very convoluted opinion. You had 4 that said we like it, you had 4 that said we don't like it, and then you had Justice Kennedy in the middle, who ended up being sort of the swing vote, saying, I don't like it for some reasons, but I like it for other reasons. And so everyone has read Justice Kennedy's opinion with care, because if you can convince Justice Kennedy, you know you're also going to convince the 4 dissenters. Mm-hmm. And what Justice Kennedy said is, the way they considered race in their plans is improper under the Constitution. I'll give you some ways you can consider race, though, that would be constitutional. And so ways that he thought you could consider race that would be constitutional is consider race when citing a school. Consider race when drawing a district boundary. Consider race when drawing the catchment area for the school. Consider socioeconomic status. It's correlated to race, but not in a one-to-one fashion, and we can divide kids up or classify them based on socioeconomic status without as much constitutional problems. And that's why the Louisville schools have sort of taken up the challenge and said, you know what, we can do that. We can listen to you, Justice Kennedy, and we can come up with a new plan that creates just as a diverse school. We're just not going to do it the old way that you found unconstitutional, but we're going to get creative and find a new way. And
Wow.
boy, have they put the time and effort into it. It matters to them.
Yeah. We take so many of our signals from them. This is a really important discussion on a great subject.
No, thanks.
I appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, it's wonderful.
It's great to meet you, Robert.
It was great to meet you as well. Enjoy talking about it.
Yeah.